Oh, shall we? All right. Well, many of you are probably already familiar with the proverbial phrase of data is the new oil. And up until today, a lot of our data has been gate-kept within the walled garden of big enterprises. And Web3 is here to change that. But as there's this famous meme, and I'm trying to do an impression of it, you don't just get data. There are a lot of idiosyncrasies with how you operate on-chain, off-chain data out of many, many different sources. And we're here to explore the blue ocean of Web3 data and how can we turn that into the new type of data mode in the Web3 era. I'm so excited to be joined by 5 leading experts in this space. We have Miko from Gumi Crypto, we have Matt from Streamer, we have Alex from Shima Capital, we have JV, who I actually work with from Protocol Labs, and we have Michael from Ceramic. So why don't we get started by each of you giving just a more elaborate intro of yourself, what you do, and more importantly, why do you care and why should we care about data in this Web3 context?
Hi, I'm Miko with Gumi Crypto's Capital. So we're an early stage venture capital firm headquartered in San Francisco. And, I guess the short version is we've done a bunch of deals since 2018, including OpenSea and Yield Guild Games, 1inch, and a whole bunch of others. And, just really in terms of why you should care, right, is really like we're talking about the internet and Web3, right? So, in a sense, data absolutely is the life's blood of the internet. And, I think it's the next pretty serious topic when it comes to blockchain and Web3 technology. So, I think data is it.
Hey, I'm Matt. I'm from Streamer. I'm the ecosystem lead there. And Streamer is a peer-to-peer data streaming or messaging network. It's typically referred to as like a layer 0 middleware for Web3 projects that want to do data pipelines or generalized messaging, that sort of a thing. Why should we care about our data footprint and how our data flows through the internet? Well, I believe that the Web3 should kind of consider itself to be more user-centric than the previous Web 2, where the Web 2 side was more about the platform and how to extract value from the users. We have an opportunity to really rewrite how the data flows on the internet work and make us central to the story. So yeah, it's very important.
Hi everyone. My name is Alex Lin. I am the head of research and an investor at Shima Capital, an early stage crypto native fund focused on pre-seed seed investments across a number of different verticals and networks. For me, I think, and I guess I want to try to avoid the echo chamber because I think we're all pretty aligned on why it's important, but I think that to summarize, I think data is a very catch-all term, and just as blockchain came into existence and Bitcoin, right, and the importance of kind of any type of digital asset, not just monetary, but also information that you put onto the internet or peer-to-peer network, for instance, is it going in? Is this idea of data. And so I think that, if you care about your digital assets in any way, shape, or form, then you should care about data and control over that. Ranging everything from privacy to how it's stored to how it's being utilized and having and maintaining control of that. So yes, I think it aligns very closely with just the general ethos of why blockchain exists.
Hey everybody, my name is John. I also go by JV. I work at Protocol Labs. I've worked on a number of things. I used to work on our research team, worked on our product team. I now work as an ecosystem lead. Protocol Labs, if you aren't familiar, we work on IPFS, Filecoin, libp2p, sort of like all the things in this decentralized infrastructure stack. I guess when I think about why Web3 and why data is important, I think for me it starts maybe less from the philosophical and maybe a little bit more from the practical. I think there's good reasons why we want to architect applications where data is separate from the application itself, which is separate from the infrastructure itself. I think there's like technical ways in which you can make that more efficient. I think there's good reasons when we start thinking about places where subjectivity needs to be inserted and how do you allow for more user control, more optionality when people think about social media and algorithms. I think it also forces a lot more considerations on the security side. So both for the philosophical of like who has access to the data, who should have choices about that. I think it's like it forces a lot of really difficult decision making up front and it forces like reconsideration. But I think it also means then that everything else scales much better. When we think about data silos, it's no longer a question of like, have we seeded everything to like individual cloud players? Like because you've been forced to confront these things earlier on, everything else can be like, do we have a market of providers or do I trust a single person or whatever? So I think there is a philosophical lens, but for me, a lot of it is, I actually think this is just a much better way of designing applications. There's hard problems to solve, but I think if we solve those, everything else will be much better and also cheaper. So yeah, I look at it from both sides.
Thanks. I'm Michael, co-founder of Ceramic, and I kind of agree with JB here in that for me, it's always been about opportunity for developers and the types of applications and experiences that are yet to be created online. And really why I think decentralized data and Web3 data is super important is it unlocks the capability of building and heading towards a future where there's 1 billion networked applications. So basically like all these applications that are able to, share the same data and have experiences that transcend a single platform. And what that does is it lowers the barrier to entry to building an application. So if you could instead just plug into an existing data repository and bootstrap your app, now you're not worrying about, well, we already know that you're not worrying about a backend because cloud has sort of abstracted it and decentralized protocols take that a step further. But now you don't even have to worry about bootstrapping users or a database. So you really can start to see the proliferation of these micro applications that are more creative and more nuanced and more specific. And these developers of these applications won't have to worry about getting 1 billion users. They just have to serve a niche really well. And that's the future that I'm excited for.
Wow, that was a lot to unpack. Let's organize this conversation and let's move from the bottom of the tech stack to the top. Why don't we start with decentralized storage and compute and CDN, and I'll actually toss over to JV to talk about what are the solutions here, what we're building, and feel free to comment on upper tech stack, but we'll just toss over to you because you're at PL.
Yeah, I think it's funny, if you look at like Filecoin's white paper, it defines generically what a decentralized storage network is, and it basically has like 2 functions of like put and get. And I think like a lot of it is actually, if we've designed these systems correctly, what we really want is to just be like, there is data, we know the data is there, and then we can like define some very basic properties. And who is the service provider should not actually be a part of that decision making. Like what you should know is like, I have thrown this over the wall to a network, I have some guarantees around what's happening, but that's now like a layer of abstraction that I can build from like as a base layer. I think the reason it's important for Web3, and especially like the different approaches people are taking, a lot of it is just trying to get to a place where you can say it doesn't have to be Google, Amazon, or Microsoft that are the only options. It's not saying they can't be options, but ideally what you want is to say like, who is the marginal provider that could offer this service? Can I get, if I would like to switch providers over time, am I able to do that? Which means like I'm not locked into one provider, I'm not having to like pay rent necessarily to like someone who might extract over time. And that hopefully leads to like cheaper opportunities. I think as we then think about all the other parts of the stack that need to be built on top, if you're going to say like anyone can run like storage, you also need to start thinking about, well, how are people going to retrieve that data? What else do they want to do with that data? There's a lot of like sub problems that build into it. But largely, yeah, from the storage side, I think a lot of what we're trying to do is just say, if you were just looking from a network layer where it's no longer just like, I'm handing it to a service provider, and because it is that service provider, I trust that they are doing the thing that I need them to do, which is keep the data around. Instead, can I have a protocol that can make sure that if I hand it off to some random third party, that random third party is actually going to execute on what they're supposed to do?
Can we double click into that? And what is the game changer here? It's content addressing. And I know Ceramics also built on IPFS. So can you tell us why, like what fundamentally make data in Web3 different in the context of IPFS and how Ceramics using that?
Sure. Yeah, so IPFS is fundamental. And we could never build something like Ceramic sort of without the lower level capabilities there. And really what it provides is when you're sort of moving sort of trust from a central server or a single entity to sort of an open collective where you aren't really able to trust your counterparty, you need to add the element of verifiability into the data itself. And so let's say you have, a very basic example, like a file that stores some note, and you want to just give it to someone on the internet, and you want to say, now give it back to me. Someone else wants to say, now give me that note. How can that second person know that the middleman or the data custodian, in this case, the IPFS network, in between didn't change the contents of that document? How do you know you got back the same thing you put in? And so in many ways, it's like, you can think of it as just like a hashing function, like a one-way function where you put something in and it gives you a unique fingerprint of what that thing is. And when you get that thing back, you go get the original content and you can guarantee that it hasn't been tampered with. And so this sort of fundamental property is really critical to provide immutability to data on Web3. And it's sort of independent, as JB said, of any particular host. So anyone, anywhere can return the data and you can intrinsically trust it. And that enables you to build all sorts of cool things on top of it.
Maybe just to add one other thing, to take it a step further, one of the reasons this is really important is if you think of how the web works now, when you were doing that retrieval process, you were trusting this data custodian. If you go to your HTTP URL, John's JPEG 1, you are trusting that whatever Google or Facebook is serving you is the thing that is supposed to be John's JPEG 1. When we're saying that we can actually verify that the content coming back to us matches the hash of the data, it means that it didn't have to come off of Facebook server, it doesn't have to come off of Google server, it could come off of a random third party or a CDN. And so when we think about, okay, how does this internet infrastructure potentially scale? Like today, the market leader for a CDN is Akamai. It's like 13 billion as a market cap. There's 4,800 points of presence. But like when you're doing things with verifiable hashes, and you can say, I don't have to trust the nodes that are distributing this data, I just have to trust the bytes that are coming back to me that they are actually matching the hash. I can now have anyone potentially be a server for that data. The ability to scale the CDN is no longer like, well, does Akamai have the funding to go put a new point of presence in whatever location? I can have I still have to coordinate my market, but I can have an open market where anyone could be a new point of presence because the end user isn't going to trust that that node is a good node. They're going to trust the data that comes back to them and just verify it's the thing they were looking for.
Miko, you have a comment?
Yeah, I think one of the questions that I think might be worth asking too, though, is for example, when you think about distributed addressing and trusting of data storage providers, it's a rational blockchain perspective, but I think I've got a much bigger fish to fry with respect to Web 2, which is, I just feel like from a problem perspective, Web 2 is fundamentally broken. I think Jack Dorsey doesn't want to run a company called Twitter, and Zuck doesn't want to run a company called Facebook. They're all running in the opposite direction, right? And I can go on the dark web and buy a single file with 8 billion name password pairs, right? And if you happen to own a Ledger hardware wallet, I actually now can download your home address. So off the dark web. So what I'm really saying is that Web 2 data is fundamentally broken, that the structure and the model is fundamentally broken. And I think the premise of Web 3, obviously we can talk about kind of the final steady state architecture of the internet, which it does involve kind of all of the addressing schemes that you're describing. But I do think that when we really talk about data, I think one of the really biggest problems that we have to solve as a community is we really have to solve kind of things like security and privacy, right? So I think those are kind of the things where I'm feeling more burning urgency, and identity as well. So I think those are bigger fish that I have to fry.
Well, and that's on the agenda. We can fry that together in just a minute. Before we move on, actually, JV mentioned some point about CDN, and that's actually more important than a lot of us realize in how they coordinate the servers to transmit data. And I'd love to pass over to Matt to talk about how Streamer is actually tackling the CDN issue and why is it superior to in the Web 2 world. First, define CDN for us.
Content distribution network, and you're right, it's kind of the forgotten piece in this data story in Web 3. So Data at rest is data storage. It's where a lot of value is extracted from, and that's great. But the data needs to arrive at the consumers to begin with, and the streamer's role is very much a kind of quiet, supportive role. It's this middleware to enable other projects to have end-to-end decentralization so that we can enable or empower data providers to have these strong security guarantees and kind of have this data pipeline that's both ethical and performant in the way that users come to expect from Web 2. So this is our role. So we are that first mile of data transport from the data provider on its way to any kind of data consumer, which can be a place of storage or some kind of enrichment of that data. We obviously don't have an opinion on this as a generalized infrastructure piece, but I'm biased. But these sorts of infrastructure plays are kind of critical because Web 2 players, they're not going to build this for us, and we don't kind of reclaim control of our data by asking for it. We need to build the tools to enable the developers to create these Web3 experiences where we're in control.
Yeah, ultimately it's about impact. Is it cheaper, faster? So I guess quick question to JV on the CDN, because I know Filecoin is also doing a CDN market. What's the ultimate impact compared to the Web 2 Akamai that you mentioned? Cheaper, cost, efficiency, speed. I'd just love to learn like a one sentence of what's the impact that why consumers should care about it.
I mean, I think there's probably two, so unfortunately it'll be two sentences.
The more the merrier.
I think one side of it is more on the supply side, where it's the fact that you have the aggregation of many independent companies that are putting out the capital outlay. You're saying that it's not the resources of a single company that's building a CDN. You're putting together like thousands of companies, which means you get much more coverage. For a CDN, the thing that you care about is geographic distribution, so you can cache locally at the edges. So like for you as a developer who's putting out stuff, hopefully the benefit is that you will have a much larger CDN, a much wider market, because it can go find the data into like whatever caching location you need to, all the way at the edge, as close as you possibly could get. And that's like where permissionless infrastructure can give you that. I think for the end user, and why that hopefully works for you, is like, yeah, it should just be faster. Like if you've on YouTube tried to load a video and you notice the ad is very quick and the actual video is very slow, that's because the ads are cached locally versus like the video, which may be coming off of a further location. So like hopefully it just means things are snappier, but yeah.
Thanks for the additional info. That's definitely helpful. Now we're getting antsy to move up the application layer because ultimately that's where us as consumer actually interface with. So I'm actually going to pass to Michael one more time to talk about, because you have a lot of dApps building on top of Ceramic, right? Tell us why they're building on top of it, what they're building. Yeah, just tell us more.
Yeah, so I guess Ceramic and the products built on Ceramic are really sort of where the rubber meets the road for the application developers, in that a lot of like what IPFS or Streamer provide are these like machine protocols. They're like lower level things that you could build developer tools on top of, and then those tools are actually what people use to build apps. And so Ceramic is a layer on top of IPFS that basically takes these content addressed hashes and just hosts them and sort of makes them ordered. So it says like, okay, we see this event, this like little arbitrary message that you sent us, we're gonna host it for you, and we're gonna tell you it happened before these other events. And so then what people use is they build things on top of Ceramic, such as ComposeDB is it's like the world's first Compose graph database. And so you can think of it a lot like Neo4j, except in Neo4j, every application has their own graph that they're writing and reading from. But on ComposeDB, all applications share the same graph. And so you really have, for the first time, the ability to model super complex relationships between the data that your app needs to run. So like if you're building a project management software, you have epics and projects and issues and comments and like all these relationships, and you have social graphs, and you have user profiles and organizations and all of these entities that need to be represented in the graph and mapped together. So now, multiple applications can be built using the same data sets with a graph database API that they're used to and familiar with, GraphQL. And so it really unlocks this whole class of applications where really today people are building things like Web3 social networks, knowledge graphs, and sort of collaboration platforms for DeSci and other sorts of like knowledge management or Wikipedia style things. We're seeing a lot of decentralized identity and reputation systems being built where you can almost think of what ComposeDB provides and in relation to a Web 2 context. One of the biggest use cases for graph database in Web 2 is this 360 view of a customer type use case where all the organizations and departments within a larger enterprise can share one view of a user and the actions they've taken and the things they've done. Like on e-commerce, it's like you looked at all of these pages and here's things you've added to your cart but never bought, and the marketing department can see that and send you emails. And so like it's that sort of platform, except in Web 3, now that's across every application. And so, yeah, we're really inspired and excited by what people have been building, but yes, ComposeDB is effectively the product that you would use to build an app on top of Web3 data, and it runs behind the scenes on all of these different protocols.
Love it, and the keyword here is composability. Yeah, that's one of the main takeaways. All right, let's move up to the top of the layer, and Alex has not spoken. Tell us about what excites you on the application layer. It's a vast space. Yeah, I'd love some examples and what excites you.
Sure, so I think so I'll try to narrow it down to kind of one specific narrative and vertical that I think is really top of mind for a lot of people, but merges essentially Web3 data and AI and ML together. So I think that when we look at Web2 products, I think we all are aware of kind of the algorithms running to really enhance the products that we use every day. Everything from recommendation engines to tailored attribution, targeted ads, et cetera. And so I think that when it comes to Web3 applications kind of mirroring that, there's a lot of opportunity, such as the benefits, as Jonathan and Michael were talking about, with what Web3 data infrastructure and the decentralization of it and the composability of it can enable, and that really comes in the form of ZK-ML type product where everything's verifiable on chain, and so it's really identifying parity between what Web3 apps can be built, such as decentralized social, Farcaster, Lens, et cetera, and trying to mirror that to Web2 products that provides the same value and utility of why we use those products in the first place. And so kind of taking a step back, what does that mean? So ZK-ML, so ZK is on the zero knowledge side, and given that we're a data panel, I'm gonna refrain from talking about ZKs, but that's really the enablement of how to ensure that this is possible and scalable. But on the ML side, the idea is that you place inference on chain. And when you break down how AI works in a very, very simple way, because it's obviously complex, you have training and you have the inference side. So the training is the actual training of the algorithms and the models that allow for the inference side, and the inference is the output of a, say, prediction. And so I want to focus on the inference side because I think on the training side it's very computationally intensive, but the inference side is particularly interesting, right? Because, for instance, you go onto a website and you receive and you serve an impression to the ad network. That ad network has and runs a ton of algorithms to decide the targeting of the ad that you would receive. And that in of itself is really interesting because it's like, how does that work? And so what Web3 data really enables from this ML side of things is this idea of complete verification. And specifically from a technical perspective, that's really understanding every sequence of that process with complete transparency. So when we talk about complete verification with ML, for instance, it's about, for instance, putting the model architecture into a smart contract, which can be verified. It's the weights associated to that model and placing those weights and understanding those parameters, so the weights being the parameters of the model, on-chain to be also verified. And then lastly, it's the actual inputs and understanding the types of data that you're actually using to train that model on-chain as well. And so when you have complete verification across all three of those things, you end up with this idea of trustless autonomy. And when you have trustless autonomy, then you can start to say, okay, I know and understand from multiple parties, from all entities, that the products that I'm using has trustless autonomy achieved because you're able to verify all stages of the AI process or ML creation process. And so I think that when you identify this benefit and how it affects the types of products that we use today in Web 2, this is very powerful, right? Because in there's so many examples of why this is important. In 2016, 2017, the deputy I think counsel's office of a state identified that in order to identify criminal justice, candidates, or I guess defendants, they would have a bias towards Black Americans, and it would have a bias to say, hey, the Black Americans were had a tendency to commit some sort of crime, right? Because the understanding of the underlying data set to facilitate that judgment and the outcome and the prediction of that was not transparent. It was not confirmed, and therefore the output affected many people. Same thing with healthcare, right? Imagine if you were misdiagnosed because the AI that underlying the prediction model didn't serve you the right prediction because we didn't understand the training data, we didn't understand the weights, and we didn't understand the actual model architecture associated. I mean, the list goes on. And so I think the idea here is that it's all about identifying and finding parity between Web 2 and Web 3 products in a way where we can now really have this idea of trustless autonomy.
Maybe two other things that, just to sort of tag on. I think one of the cool things when we talk about data as well is, again, we're sort of starting just with what are additional primitives that make it hopefully easier to do things. So if you think about even a model, if someone is trying to reproduce results or even just verify what was the thing that went into it, having the content identifiers of just knowing and people who are doing research, I'm sure you run into this too, someone will give you a notebook and be this is the thing I ran, and it will start with CSV or whatever final CSV. You don't really know what is the version of the data that was being worked with. And so even when we're talking about just moving science forward, I think just having Web3 primitives is incredibly powerful. I think another thing that's interesting to think about is even in the structure, I'm sure folks have looked at ChatGPT and OpenAI and LLMs in general. If you think of the capital flows there, where it's OpenAI raised tons of money, they now have the funds to go pull all the data off the internet to scrape, and then spend massive amounts of money with Azure to be able to train their LLM. It's interesting when you re-architect, if you could push compute down to the data itself. So data centers around the world, we're talking about if you are an individual researcher who's trying to reproduce or create your own LLM, if instead the capital outlay is by individual storage providers and you can send messages to them to say here is the data that I'm trying to run computation over, each storage provider is amortizing that over everyone else who might be also running those transformations. And so the actual net cost to a researcher will go down, and the ability for the long tail of people to be able to run these sorts of operations should go down as well. It's just moving where is the capital spend and where are the bottlenecks, which interestingly, if you're thinking about it from data goes into model, then someone has to train the model, and where does the value accrual happen? The ability to say that anyone can do the computation, that now is a market-based thing, so that should go down. The ability of the model generator to extract value goes down, because if that is no longer a bottleneck, anyone can train a model, so the ability to value extract at the model layer goes down, which means it has to then accrue to whoever is creating the data, because that's the only thing that's now the proprietary bit. So I think what's interesting about Web3, and I know we've talked philosophically, I also think the architecture implies a lot of the things that we really do care about, which is how do you create more competition and then have the value flows go back to where is the value being created?
I just wanted to build a little bit also on something that Michael said earlier, really about indexing, right? Because the use case that you were describing is kind of aggregating essentially information around a user. Right, and I think one of the things that's so interesting is when you touch on what Alex was saying about ZK and privacy, right? Then to me, one of the atomic infrastructures that's sort of missing in action is kind of the identity model, right? Because I feel like this, right? Which is when you think about something as high flying as like the metaverse, right? Like there's really two ways to sort of SQL join distributed data, right? You can either distribute it around something like an NFT, which is sort of like an object, right? So the object can basically serve as an integration between, because the thing that I think is really critically important is that people talk about distributed data, right? But they don't really talk about the control of the data, right? So when you think about the control of the data, in order to join two distributed data sets, you actually need permission, right, to join, right? So the thing that's really interesting about kind of like this Web3 emergence is that in a way, like the identity or individual becomes not only the private key, but the individual also becomes sort of like the primary key, right? And I'm going kind of now to like SQL database theory, right? Which is
I love
that,
it.
right? Which is that the individual is the thing that integrates, right? That you can use to perform joins, right? So I guess what I'm really saying is that one of the missing pieces of infrastructure that I'm kind of passionate about is identity and the identity system, which I think is kind of inseparable from data and data storage, especially as people start identifying with wallets and they identify with PFPs and they identify with pseudonymity and so in a sense like the identity itself becomes decentralized, right? So identity itself becomes data and data becomes identity and like so in a sense like the whole conversation is kind of wrapped, the application conversation is wrapped around the concept of identity and the new concept of identity, not the old one.
Maybe just to riff on the autonomous AI vision, I think one way to hook in our data into this sort of on-chain AI mechanism would be access control. So if the access control of our data, which is controlled by our private keys, is on-chain, then you can imagine a certain set of data streams about you, or you're driving your car and you're emitting a data exhaust, and that access control is controlled on-chain. Then you can imagine an AI presence could perhaps interact with that access control policy that you create. The policy might be, I accept tokens and I will give this AI a time-based access to my data. And so the AI starts to use your data, understands, yes, there is predictability, improvement in my models based on your data, and so I'll keep paying this user for their data, and that's a very sustainable way.
So what I wanted to springboard off what you're saying is that this model isn't science fiction, right? It already exists, which is that if you have the Brave browser, right, you can actually opt in to seeing ads, and then you can actually be paid, right? You can actually get money, right? So I think from an adoption model perspective, telling end user consumers, oh, you really want to preserve the privacy of your data and not sell it to Facebook, like users don't care, right? But what users do care about is you get money, right? Like users care about that. So if you look at the Brave browser model, it replicates what you're saying, and it's alive and functional today with millions of users, right? So that's kind of exciting. Like it's exciting because users are giving their permission to AIs to target ads to them today, right? So I guess I'm very interested in go-to-market, right? I'm very interested in kind of like how things are born, right? And I think identity is super hard. It's super hard for identities to be born because if you look at Web2 identity, there was this beautiful tech project called OpenID, right? And it turns out that the identity controllers of Web2 are Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, right? It's app-driven, right? The app people, not the infrastructure people, not the best technology people. It's the app people that control the identities, right? So that's kind of why I think this is super interesting and why I think something like Brave Browser is interesting because it's kind of the first example in the wild of this kind of identity model that's actually working, right? It's actually millions of users are benefiting, which is great.
Yeah, I just want to say that people don't care until something happens, right? And I think that
there you go.
It's also important to, I guess, inform individuals that you have the choice. So even though, yes, people might not care and they're like, I actually want Apple to, store and track my health data because I don't want to do it myself. Well, the idea is, okay, but if some shit goes down where Apple sends, your health data or your health data is compromised for whatever reason, or your insurance company, premium goes up because somehow they have access to predicting you might have a heart attack in the next 6 months. Well, you'll care then, and you'll want to turn it off then. And so right now we don't have the option to make that change, and I think that with what Web3 enables is ensuring that that option is available to consumers. And I think that I just want to quickly add that, a very interesting area that is tangential to this or orthogonal to this is hardware. So a lot of the on-ramp of data to a decentralized form still comes from copies that exist in centralized forms. Right? If you look at the types of data that we're bringing on-chain via oracles, the data is originating from off-chain sources that is still centralized. If we really envision this decentralized world and we believe in trust and et cetera, we really have to think about what is the point of on-ramp of these assets, these data assets, and decentralizing the hardware that those assets might come from, whether it's from a car, whether it's from IoT devices, et cetera. So that's just another area that really excites me.
I just wanted to quickly mention, because you brought up Apple. It's funny, this also, so when you think about Apple, I don't know if people remember recently in the new iPhone update or one of the more recent ones, you can now encrypt your data and it won't be visible on iCloud. It's all managed on your local device and your keys. And it's funny because a lot of what Apple is doing is I actually think really great, and a lot of the things that people probably from the Web3 side really appreciate as philosophically, principally, except that it is still locked inside of their ecosystem. And I think largely the bets that we're making is can we build that as just common internet infrastructure where it's not just because you live in the Apple bubble that you get all of this nice interoperability with all of the other devices. It's can we just make this a broader primitive for everything? So I think for people who are maybe more Web3 skeptical, if you really enjoy a lot of the things that Apple does for you, I think just ask the question, why does it have to only be in Apple's ecosystem? Can we build broader primitives that make it cross-platform?
I love that. Well, we're coming up on time. The last question I want to ask is, describe a future state of an application or innovation that you're most excited about related to data, and what's really the impact that drives to consumer. We can feel it. So who do I pick on? Because that's kind of a last-minute question.
I'm happy to kick
right.
off. So
all right, let's do
one
Mika.
of the things that I think I'm super excited about is actually generative AI, because I kind of come from, I'm actually a Yaley, but I come from neuroscience, and people ask me why I'm not working in AI, and I think it's because AI has largely been used in an extractive way, right? And so it's really AI has contributed to wealth inequality, and it really is just kind of this very extractive technology until fairly recently, where the capabilities of generative AI have started to take off, right? So to me, one of the applications I'm excited about are things really related to the entertainment industry, related to kind of metaverse integration, related to kind of generation of 3D models in gaming. So a lot of these applications I think are pretty exciting to me. And I think it's really one of the first times where we see a real promise for metaverse interoperability is kind of you can actually have AIs kind of transporting models between different environments. So I think that application is pretty exciting. So I just want to tip the hat to generative AI as opposed to kind of more the classical AI.
I'd like to see, or I'm very excited for more data unions. These are data DAOs, basically forming a collective and providing a consumer experience where it's an X to earn, a drive to earn, or a surf the internet to earn, do something and have sort of a certain data accumulate. And as the DAO accumulates data, it kind of grows in value based on the kind of the volume or the density of the data, because then it becomes quite interesting to AI models when you reach a certain critical point of data where the value becomes enough to be able to be redistributed to all the data providers. So those sorts of patterns are very interesting to me. I think we'll see a lot more of them. And I also think that will be perhaps one of the first tastes of crypto for a lot of folks that are maybe crypto skeptical. They can use these consumer applications that kind of obscure away all all the nasty transactions and whatnot, they kind of opt in a very ethical and open way to provide data, and they receive fair monetary returns back.
For me, I think, so there was a panel earlier in the other room on consumer and what Web3 enables with consumer and this idea of co-creation. I think that there are different elements of the types of assets that you are bringing forth as a co-creator of certain brands and companies and traditional, I guess, entities. And so what does that actually look like in which your data and the stuff that you actually bring to life, which should and be controlled by and owned by you, manifests in a way that the value derived from that as it's distributed also goes back to you as you co-create with brands that you work with, for instance. And so I think this idea of user-generated content will really kind of see a different, will have a different form factor as we continue to build out better data infrastructure to enable that in a decentralized, transparent way.
I guess a little bit of a riff. I actually also agree on the data union is one of the more exciting things. I mean, Kat has heard me rant about this. I think like the monetization pieces are probably further away. I think there's other primitives that need to be built to make that happen, but I still think we will derive a lot of value, specifically for like public research type things, and just reproducibility of research by being able to say like, here is a hard link to this specific piece of data, and having like community-owned data sets, whether that is individually from like people who just care in like a research community, whether it's grants from governments, whatever else, things that are virtual versions of the Internet Archive, CERN, of just like with different policies of like, how do we need to preserve this data, and just being able to verify that that's happening. I think that's gonna incredibly move science forward by itself.
Sorry, can I interrupt really quickly? Because I think that enables a really interesting new paradigm of self-regulation. And when we have open data and the data layer that everyone can essentially access, you essentially, like the whole GDPR stuff, actually I have to watch what I say. So GDPR, in my mind, it's like regulatory bodies and entities that come in are Band-Aid solutions, in my opinion. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done from a self-regulatory perspective in the types of, for instance, smart contract languages that we use to enhance security and safety of individuals and as it relates to data. And I think that is enabled by, data unions, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that creates a whole new opportunity as well.
And for me, it's something that JV and I were talking a bit about before backstage. It's really the emergence of modularized reputation systems. And it's not necessarily like one particular use case, but as a result of applications being built on open data architectures and users sort of like signing and having authority over their own information, you really unbundle sort of the reputation systems that power the world and our internet today, in that you have these open data sets and you can separately make a judgment about an actor online based on different interpretations of the same data set. And so you could, have reputation that follows you around, reputation that's not static. There's not like one universal score, but it's rather every single application has different needs and requirements for what constitutes good behavior on their own system. And so all these different systems could have a much more rich understanding of who you are to make judgments about what you can and can't do within their bounds. And I think that that's going to be really powerful for the types of interactions that can be enabled online and ones that don't need to necessarily rely on formerly centralized entities saying like, yes, you are a real person or you're a citizen of this country. And so you can trade on Uniswap or you can't.
Well said. And thank you, everyone. That's a wrap. Please give a round of applause to our panelists today.
Okay, thank you so much. That was the last panel for this morning. We have about a 45-minute break until the next panel at 1:30. See everyone then.